everyone! Welcome back to this week's episode of Hand the Mic Over. I'm your host, Mevish, and today I have a very special guest with me. She's an educated young woman in STEM with a myriad of languages as a part of her background. So without further ado, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Celina. I'm 23 years old, and I'm from Cambodia, but I was born here in Canada.
For anyone who may be listening and isn't familiar, could you tell us where on the map it is?
Yes, so it's in Asia, near Vietnam, near the Philippines, like Southeast Asia. That's what I always click whenever I'm doing like surveys and they ask for a demographic. It's like Southeast Asia.
Because they never actually have a Cambodian option, right?
Oh, yeah, we're too small of a country.
Such a common experience.
Yeah.
Anyway, what languages are spoken in Cambodia?
Mostly Khmer, which some people call Cambodian, but the actual name is Khmer and it's spelled Khmer. Some English too.
Can you speak Khmer?
Very little. I understand it more fluently, but I'd say my speaking skills are a little embarrassing. But I'm like trying to learn, and I've been trying, I guess, my whole life. It's just like hard because there's not a lot of people to practice with.
Is there any word you could teach me in Khmer?
Yeah, I could teach you how to say hello. So this is like a formal hello, and then normally you'd say this to like elders, you'd like kind of put your hands together in like a prayer motion, and it's Jamriap Sua. I'll say it again slowly. It's Jamriap Sua.
Jamriap Sua.
Pretty good. Yeah, that's actually one of the better times I've heard it being said.
Okay.
Yeah.
In the past, like on the podcast, whenever I have to say something in another language, I've done horribly.
You know what? Maybe you should plan a trip to Cambodia.
I would love to
You have
go.
to teach me. Yeah.
So you mentioned that you were born here. Which region of Toronto or Canada did you grow up in?
I was born in Toronto, kind of west end, and then I moved to more towards Scarborough, but still in North York. And then that's where I would grow up, I'd say.
Were your parents immigrants or your grandparents?
So my parents were born in Cambodia, but then they came to Canada when they were pretty young. My mom came to Canada, my dad went to France. So they got their education in the more western region. They met in Canada and then.
Okay. Would you say your community growing up was more on the multicultural side? Was it maybe more of like one culture than the other? And also, did you have any Cambodian peers growing up?
I would say it was very like multicultural where I grew up. I think anyone who grew up in Toronto, most people who grew up in Toronto would say that, like very multicultural, which is a good thing. I haven't really been around that many Asians in my life, like in school, just because I went to French schools a lot and I don't think there's that many Asians who speak French fluently. But that was my first language at home. So yeah, I think my friend group is a lot more diverse. I don't think I've actually met another Cambodian person naturally, like not at like the temple. So I have this thing where I'm like, I can't marry a Cambodian because in my head, they're all my cousins or like they're all my family. Just because the only Cambodians I've met are like my family or like people related to my family. So
was the temple in Scarborough, North York as well?
It's in Newmarket. There's a large Cambodian population more north of where I was, maybe like an hour and a half away. That's where like most of the Cambodians went to if they came to like the GTA area.
Were you able to meet other Cambodians from a very young age, or were you a bit older when you found more people from your community?
I was definitely older, so I'd say maybe in high school because that's when I started getting more involved in the temple. So I did traditional dancing for 1 to 2 years in high school. Yeah, it was very nice to be able to connect with my culture in that way. So I did that, and that's when I met people who are like more my age, who I'm still in touch with now, and I see them at the temple every so often. It's always great to like hang out.
Okay, that's lovely to hear. Do you remember what school was like for you, if you ever felt like you were different from the people around you, or if you didn't really have much representation?
I never really felt that way just because it was so diverse. I don't think anyone really felt like they were represented by another classmate super well. There were maybe a couple people, but I never really noticed it. When I was younger, I'd tell people like, oh, I'm from Cambodia. They would have no idea where that was. I remember in high school, so we were still like pretty old. I told this person, I was like, oh yeah, I'm Cambodian. He was like, wait, I thought you were Asian. And I was like, how? And then we like later found out he thought I meant Cameroon, which is in Africa. And I was like, but then as I've grown older, people know what Cambodia is. So like that's like my bar of how like, recognized my culture is like if they've heard of the country.
When you were able to then find your community, what was that change like for you?
I think I felt like I didn't know my culture as much as I maybe should, just because again, like I didn't have a lot of Cambodian peers. So like some of the inside jokes I wouldn't really really understand. And my parents did raise me like other Cambodian parents typically do. So I was able to relate to them in that sense. But other things, it was a little harder for me to relate to them. I think that I still felt welcomed and it was still really cool to learn more about my culture, I guess.
Yeah, learning never stops.
Hmm.
Would you say that you feel closer to being Cambodian or Canadian?
That's a good question. I hate to admit it, but probably Canadian because I feel like I've just grown up in Canada my whole life and like I'm just not as in tune with my culture as I wish I was. Like I've only been to Cambodia once in my life and this was in like high school. It was pretty late in my life. All of my family is either in Toronto or in Montreal. So like my grandparents, my aunts, uncles, cousins, everyone. Also just like growing up around the media, you're very influenced by Canadian like Western media, a lot less the Cambodian Eastern media. So yeah, just stuff like that.
It's hard, yeah, especially because when you're like a child of an immigrant as well, I feel like you're kind of balancing between your home culture and then your outside of home culture. At some point, the scales kind of tip in one direction or the other. And usually it's the culture that you yourself are immersing yourself in.
Yeah. So like one thing I've been like kind of wondering is like, will my kids be able to speak Cambodian? Like I barely speak Cambodian. And then my parents speak Cambodian, but they speak less than like my grandparents do. So it's just like slowly fading and I'm like stressed about that, even though I don't even have any prospects in terms of baby making. But yeah.
That's so relatable though. I've thought about it too. I remember I met this woman and she had kids that were like a little bit younger than me and they didn't speak Urdu at all, which is our native language. And she could speak Urdu. So she was like, "Oh, did you come here directly from Pakistan?" Well, I was like, "Oh no, like I was born here." She was like, "Can you speak Urdu?" I was like, "Yeah, I can." Like to some extent. She's like, "Yeah, your kids is where it's gonna end." I was like,
That's
"How
brutal.
how could you say that to me?" What? She was like, "That's just what happened."
That's so brutal. No, okay, well, to be honest, like my main languages are English and French. I'm determined to make my kids speak French, but
Okay.
Khmer, like I don't know how we're gonna do that. I don't know how we're gonna accomplish that, but
Maybe YouTube.
maybe. But honestly, I'm like kind of surprised every time that there's a parent who speaks two languages and then the child doesn't speak like any of the second language. I'm like always kind of surprised because I would feel it would just lead through naturally, you know, like if they're on the phone with someone else who speaks that second language, the child would like pick up on it. But I have friends who only speak English and their parents speak like so many languages. And I'm like,
Oh, really?
yeah.
To be fair, I grew up speaking Urdu primarily at home, but over the years, I feel like my Urdu has faded too.
Oh, yeah.
So
For
maybe that's what it is.
some people, like, they just never learn. But their English is like better than mine. So, you know, pros and cons to everything.
I feel like sometimes I can't English either. It's just a constant struggle.
Yeah.
What would you say is the importance of French in your upbringing?
It was my first language. So that's the main language I speak with my parents. Just because, like I said, my dad went to France, my mom went to Montreal after they left Cambodia. So I speak to them in French. I think that it's just like a part of my personality now. Like I'm that girl who speaks French, just because not many people can say that they speak French at a level higher than French immersion. I never got bullied from it. I know my sister did sometimes
Oh,
when she went to an
really?
English school. Yeah, because they'd be like, oh, like not bullied, maybe bullied is a strong word, but they'd be like, oh, like the Frenchie. Like they'd
Oh,
always like expect her to like do super good in French class. That would just be like her stereotype. And I know it annoyed her, but I never got that just because I did go to a French school too. So everyone I knew spoke French. And then so I'm in pharmacy school and I was able to talk to patients in French who had just were like new to the country or were visiting from the French speaking country. So that was really interesting and cool. I think overall it's just like a huge asset being able to speak French. Cambodia did get colonized by France, so it's kind of like a joke, like speaking our colonizers' language, but whatever.
even if you can't fully connect to Cambodia through Khmer, you do have that French connection in a
Yeah,
way.
kind of. So one thing is like really funny because my family speaks Khmer and French. So I'll speak to like my grandparents in Khmer and then when I don't know a word, I'll switch to French. And that's just like very natural for me to speak, like just switch between Khmer and French all the time. But then when I go to the temple, Cambodians don't normally speak French. So at the temple, I have to switch between Khmer and English. And that is like so hard for me to do because I'm so used to knowing how to switch from Khmer to French, but not Khmer to English. And like, yeah, it's just
Yeah.
communication is not easy.
What about when you're speaking English and you can't find a word?
Oh, then it's just like game over. If I don't know the word in English, I don't know it in any other language.
Okay, but that's so interesting. You have quite a few languages. You sound like those parents you were just describing earlier who can speak multiple.
I'm like 25% of their power.
When you were describing your French immersion school, was it just a French program or were there also English programs in the same school too?
No, it was not even just French immersion. We were like a completely French school, our only English classes were like English class. We had students who like did not speak any English at all. Yeah, there were not that many Asians, definitely no Cambodians there.
When did you switch from French school to English school?
In university. And let me tell you, it was rough because I did not know like all of these terms, like you know what a cat ion is, right?
Mm-hmm.
I was like, oh, that's a cation. And everyone was like, excuse me? And I was like, what? Like, that's how it's pronounced now. And then, yeah, that was like so embarrassing. But
So you were doing science, math, like everything just in French?
yeah. Because like cat ion in French is like cation. So I saw that. I was like, cation. And they were like, girl.
Oh no. Okay, so that transition of learning science in a completely different language your whole life and then or jumping into university level science in a different language. Did you find yourself having to use some sort of translator or something?
Yeah, for sure. At the beginning, I'd be like Googling. Luckily, like a lot of the words are pretty similar. So like cell is like cellule. Yeah, now I'm starting to like forget what it's called in French. Some of like more complicated words, I was definitely like Googling what it is in English or like what it was in French. And then like I got the hang of it pretty quickly just because there's so much content to learn in school. Like you have to just keep repeating it and get through it. And then again, like because of the media and stuff, I knew like what a liver was, for example. And like even though it's called something completely different in French.
What's the
Yeah,
word?
it's foie.
Oh,
So like
right,
you know
foie gras.
exactly. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
That's like fat liver.
Oh, wow. That sounds really hard. I don't know if I could ever. Like, I'm thinking it's the opposite for me. English to just French. I don't know if I could do that.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, French is a very hard language. That's why I went as soon as I got the chance to an English school. And like a lot of my classmates went to like London or Ottawa just because they had French programs. I was like, absolutely not. I think they have a lot of exceptions, they have a lot of rules. And then also just the like job prospects. I don't think if I know I wanted to stay in Toronto, which I do, getting like an education in English just opens up way more opportunities. And then also I would look at the kids in TDSB, like the Toronto District School Board, and they had like a lot more opportunities than we did at our small French school.
Oh,
so like they got to
really?
go on like more field trips and had better teachers. Our art teacher was the same as our computer science teacher at one point or something. Like we did not have a lot of funding or resources.
Oh, wow. You know, it's so crazy because until this conversation, I didn't even know that fully French only schools were different from French immersion.
Yeah, the school board is called CSV Monde, and then there's also a Catholic French only
No
school board
way.
too. Yeah.
All my life, I thought it was just TDSB, TCDSB, and then private schools. That's it.
Yeah, no. People would be like, "Oh, you're French immersion, right?" And it used to offend me because I'm like, "No, I'm not French immersion." Because like the French immersion kids would not speak French very well. But I get like offended.
Crazy. So many languages, language switches.
It's just like something I have to deal with, and it's not as bad. The issue I have now is that I'm starting to lose the languages. So like I said, I jumped straight out of French. I was like, no more French. But now I feel like I'm like losing it a little. And then Cambodian, I just like never knew. I don't know. I'm trying to figure out how to like keep it besides just speaking with my parents. Yeah. I don't know if you have like the same struggle. You do, right? How you're like losing
I
your
mean,
Urdu
yeah,
stuff?
like for Urdu, yeah. I've like tried. I know you need to have a lot of discipline for it. Like my sister, I remember she started teaching herself how to read and write it on her own just so she could hold on to it. Like I saw her notebooks and her writing and learning, and I was like, this is a lot of work. I feel like if you really want to be able to pass it down, you need to know it yourself enough.
Yeah.
It scares me too.
Is it a completely different alphabet?
Yeah.
That's hard. Khmer is too.
The exceptions and the rules and everything like you were describing, like I'm not familiar with those a lot of the time. I can speak it, so like verbally I've heard the exceptions, I guess, but in writing and reading and stuff, I'm not familiar. And another thing is, I feel like I learned the casual version growing up. There's also like a very formal version that's used in literature or poetry, for example. I don't understand that. I don't know if Khmer or even like French, there's something similar. I mean, I took French in school up to, high school, but I don't remember if we ever learned a different, more advanced French versus like a more casual French.
I think there probably are. And then there's also the differences between like Quebecois French and France French.
Right.
So I don't know the difference between the two. To me, they all have the same rules, but I know they don't. So like if you say tu to like someone, I think the Quebecers would be okay with it. But in France, you have to like say vous to them. I don't know if you remember that rule.
Yes. So vous is for elders and also for plural, and tu is for singular and general, I guess casual people.
Yeah. And I think also people who you know well, I think you can say tu to your like grandparents. I have a funny story. My aunt, she was raised there in Montreal and she still lives there.
Mm-hmm.
And some people see her and I don't think there's that many Asians either. So they assume that she speaks only English, but her English is really bad. So they'll talk to her in English, but the employees or whatever also have really bad English. So they're both just speaking to each other in broken English and neither one of them wants to say that they speak French fluently. And it's just like really fun to watch, actually.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Sounds like a whole different country sometimes.
Yeah, but you know what I found out recently? A lot of people from Montreal, like there's a big group who just don't speak French at all. Like they only speak English.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so like my housemate in first year of pharmacy school is from Montreal and he doesn't speak any French. I was so surprised. Like he could understand. I had never heard of that before.
That means I guess that there's like fully English schools there, just like how there's fully French schools here.
Maybe, actually, yeah, like high schools. I know there's definitely fully English universities. Like McGill, I think, is completely English. And then even some CJEBs, which are like schooling that they do after high school, are also fully English, some of them. But
Oh, really? Interesting. Have you ever had an experience where you felt like you were discriminated against while living here?
not really like directly discriminated against, just because I feel like people just don't really know what Cambodia is.
Mm-hmm.
There's always like those Asian jokes, you know, like I don't even want to say them, but like you can probably imagine them, which are just like not funny. Like, please get a better sense of humor. I don't know.
Yeah.
But like, I don't take offense to those. I'm just like, you're kind of a loser. I know that within Asian, there's a stereotype of like how Cambodians are less educated, which unfortunately I don't want to say is true, but I think education is less prioritized just because there's been so many wars and people just are trying to survive. They're not necessarily prioritizing getting educated. And that kind of bleeds over when they come to Canada and they raise children. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm gonna be honest. I think you're the only person with a Cambodian background that I've ever met in my life.
Yeah.
Even at that, I only met you for 6 weeks when I was
I know.
in
Yeah.
high school for co-op.
Yeah. Well, you're welcome. We're great people. But I know it's like to the point where if one of my friends will meet a Cambodian, they'll like go out of their way to tell me, oh, I met another Cambodian. But like you don't really get that with like other cultures for like bigger countries, I guess.
The cultures that are more populated in Toronto, you definitely don't hear that at all. I'm like trying to think of like some like Cambodian specific questions, but I'm learning for the first time about Cambodia. I don't have anything specific.
It's a great country. Cambodia is most famous for like temple there, so like Angkor Wat. That's definitely not how you pronounce it. But yeah, that temple was like probably what most people know Cambodia for. And then the city, the capital is Phnom Penh. And maybe we're also most famous for like the genocide. One thing I found out actually very recently, which maybe I should have known from beforehand, but like, you know, when Americans are like, oh, we fought in the Vietnam War, they were fighting Cambodians. Everyone's always like, wow, you're a soldier, like you're a trooper. But like, they were fighting my people. I like just found this out, not
Wait,
recently, but
what?
like,
Vietnam War happened in Cambodia or Cambodians came to Vietnam? What's going on here?
it was a fight against communism. So the Vietnam War was South Vietnam, who was supported by the US, and then North Vietnam, which was supported by like the Soviet Union and China. We were also part of like that side of like North Vietnam because basically the US did not like communism, so they supported South Vietnam. So yeah, when people say it was like fought in the Vietnam War, it was they think like North versus South Vietnam, but then like Cambodia was also involved in like I'm sure the other countries nearby too. You killed
Yeah,
my
I've definitely heard Vietnam War flashbacks and stuff like that. being,
Yeah,
like, very casually mentioned.
I was like surprised too. I was like, oh,
You learn something new every day.
yeah.
Your experience of growing up in Canada is one of a kind. I have not come across someone who has so many languages, so many backgrounds, and such a unique way of growing up and having all those. For you, growing up and feeling more Canadian, did you ever feel like your experience of being Canadian or what you feel is Canadian was not really the general Canadian culture, if that makes sense?
Oh, yeah, for sure. No, yeah, I get what you mean. It's definitely very different than like when you think Canadian, what you typically think of. But I think what typical Canadian is like changing every day. I guess like Western Canadian is very different because there were like the Asian influences. So I think my parents were very strict because they grew up in Canada and like got educated in Canada. They had more of a focus on education. So that's why I was pushed so hard to study hard. And now I'm in pharmacy school. Yeah, that was cool. Of course, playing piano, just like having like crazy curfews or even not even being able to like leave the house, just stuff like that. I think every child of an immigrant gets the feeling of like being embarrassed about like their lunch because it's not like a sandwich, it's a noodle dish or something.
Yep.
So there were always those small differences. Like I definitely am Canadian, but I don't really feel any patriotism. I live here, I'm grateful, but I would not fight for this country.
I've like talked about this with my sister and just with like family, and something that I've always wondered, where do I belong really? Because I feel like, of course, I grew up here, my home is here, my family, my community, my schooling, like everything is Canadian. But I would not say that I'm like a general Canadian. There was always those immigrant background influences, good different cultural influences, and sometimes I feel like I'm not Canadian enough to be from Canada, but I'm also not Pakistani enough to be fully from Pakistan because I did grow up here. And then I'm like, wait, so what am I? Where do I belong?
I know, yeah. But that's why, like, I just wish I had more Cambodian peers where I could be like, oh, I belong with them, you know?
Yeah.
Where, like, they're all feeling that way.
That was definitely something that helped me, like finding other kids who were South Asian as well. I was like, okay, we kind of have a community of our own that we're building here now. So yeah.
It's definitely interesting. I don't really think of, of where I belong that much. But that's, like, a good question to consider, like, just with, like, family, wherever they are.
Yeah, that's what I've been hearing constantly on the podcast and what I've realized in my life too. Wherever your people are, whether that's your family, your friends, your community, your culture, whatever, that's where I feel like you end up feeling like you belong.
Yeah, and I feel like a lot of people are like very interested in hearing and learning about other cultures. So like I love learning about other cultures too. From there's just not really a divide anymore. Like all of my friends are from different parts of the world.
That's all for this week's episode of Hand the Mic Over. Tune in next week to hear part 2, the finale of our 2-part Cambodia series. As always, be sure to check us out on Instagram at Hand the Mic Over to see pictures from today's episode, and you can find our other episodes on YouTube and Spotify at Hand the Mic Over.